All right, good morning. It is 11 a.m. on the East Coast. It's the Osmo.com. Week 15, daily fantasy NFL show. Our final thoughts. Chris Randone, Zal Vitri, presented by our wonderful sponsor, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. Sal, good morning, man. How are you?
Doing good, man. Doing good this morning. How are you doing? How are you, man?
Man, I'm doing good. Yesterday was my birthday. So,
Really?
just, yeah. Went
Happy
to
belated.
thanks, my man. Went to the Lakers game. My wife surprised me with tickets, so it was a fun time. And yeah, man, I got to take a shot on the court afterwards, so that was pretty cool.
Very nice. Did you make the shot?
I did it, man. I'm not gonna lie, I had so much confidence because I had like a bomber jacket on. I don't want to make excuses, but I like walked up. I'm feeling confident. I think like JaVale McGee was like right there, and I'm like, man, I'm gonna make this shot. I'm gonna sink it. Like it's a no brainer. And yeah, nah, it didn't go in. And I don't even think it hit the rim, Sal. I'm not even gonna lie. It was
You had that was your one maybe scouting chance right there. Somebody sees
yeah,
it and you think something.
yeah, man. Like when you get so confident that you don't think about anything else, but for sure you're just feeling on top of the world.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy because right after that, I just felt like the worst person in the world because everyone was watching. I'm like, man, this is embarrassing. I was like, get me out of this stadium ASAP.
Put the hood on.
Dude, yeah, put the jacket over my head and had that walk of shame because you have to like walk out this carpet. But no, it was a great time, man, and it was a great experience. But I'm excited to talk Week 15, man. It's nice to see that we have some interesting people at the top of ownership right now with the updated projections. Uh, Excited to get your final thoughts on this slate. But before we do, for everyone in here, don't forget our wonderful sponsor, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, always still running those baller tournaments week in and week out. And if you haven't signed up yet, I mean, they have a great deal where if you use the code AWESEMO, AWESEMO, you can get 3 free entries essentially with those Yahoo reward points into that tournament. So if you haven't signed up yet, we speak about this all the time, but not all the top players in the game play on Yahoo. And if you're looking for maybe a little bit more of a softer field, maybe a little bit more of a way that you can have essentially an advantage against other players that normally people don't normally play against. So, yeah, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, thank you once again. So, week 15, man. I got the updated ownership projections, and we'll go through the buy or sell format first. And then as we transition, we'll go into kind of who you like for the GBP plays, cash plays, and then maybe some outliers, maybe some guys that are not on anyone's radar that maybe you think might be optimal plays. But we go into DraftKings first, man. Saquon Barkley, 7,700. He's still up at the top at 31.8%. I want to say this before I hand it over to you. Miami defense against the running back position has really been putrid all year. However, though, it's a little bit different these last, I would say, 4 games where they were at the top of the pack of really surrendering the most yards, touchdowns. I mean, you could run all over them. However, though, they're kind of in the middle of the pack now. And not that I'm going to say that this is anything to be take notice of, but Saquon Barkley, man, hasn't really done much. And I would love to get your thoughts on, is it risky to know that, this is chalk, he's 7,700, but I mean, what has he done for you? Because essentially he hasn't really done much from fantasy standpoint.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked at the end of the year if we saw Saquon getting some sort of surgery or something on his ankle and that he's just playing injured because he's not the same person right now. The line has gotten worse. So that can be part of it. It's also not a great team dealing with a lot of injuries on offense all season. But where he comes in right now this week, 31.8% ownership, I think it's okay. I mean, it's a good player in a good spot. Finally, a home favorite, which he usually is not on this Giants team, and it's a fair price point. But there's so many guys that running back right around him in that price range where what I'm seeing right now for myself, at least, is not a lot of them are breaking free. I'll just get somewhere between 15 and 25% of all of them. So I personally will probably have less than that, but I don't think there's anything wrong with if you told me you had 30% Saquon. I don't think it's terrible. If you had 35, 40%, I don't think it's terrible. It's just a good player in a good spot at a fair price point. So I'm not really too worried about that ownership, but I probably will have a little bit less just because right now I'm getting a pretty balanced approach in all those 7K guys.
Do you have any guys in that same price range that maybe are showing up projected for a little bit more or maybe a little bit more of an optimal play compared to Saquon?
Yeah, so in the same price point for me, just when you so yeah, the optimal play would be like the keyword there. When I do projections, just point wise, Saquon I have pretty significantly ahead of a guy like Fournette, but he's right around Carson for me and Zeke. He's ahead of both of them, but not by enough to where the ownership is making up for it. So I would say Zeke would be more of an optimal play for me. Right now on the Ultimate ownership projections, Zeke is coming in at pretty much like a third of the ownership as Saquon, and I only have him projected for about 1.5 fantasy points less. So that's a pivot that I would probably make. That's why I'll probably end up with around 20% Zeke, and it'll pull down some of my Saquon.
How much Saquon do you think will be in cash game lineups?
That's a really good question. Probably, I would say somewhere around similar to that field number, maybe like 30%. There's just so many guys in that range that it's not like he's the only guy in the 7K range. Those 4 guys in that 7K range are all very worthy cash plays. So I would say very similar to what this GPP ownership looks like on him if I had to bet.
In that same game, on the opposing side, same position, running back, Patrick Laird, who is now becoming a thing after weeks and weeks of people on Twitter and people messing around with this guy's name. Well, now he's kind of solidifying himself as an actual play here, 4,500, 23.1%. Where's your mindset on with this guy? And is this really a legitimate value play?
Yeah, so I do think it's a legitimate value play. I think the ownership on it is okay right now. I would say that I'll probably come in less just because of the way I'm building lineups right now. We'll probably touch on, well, I think he's number 6 in ownership, but when we get there, a guy like Gurley is just making my lineups become a little bit different. He's not a crazy value, but he is cheap enough to get my lineups to look differently. So yeah, Patrick Laird right now at 23%. You saw 80% snaps last week, 19 touches. Beneficial matchup here is just a 3-point underdog on the road against the Giants. And, the pass catching responsibilities are there for him. And he just stays on the field because of pass protection. He might not be needed as much in pass protection this week in a close spread and the Giants having a really bad pass rush. So that could be a knock against him, but it's just a price point. This slate, there's outside of him in that $4,500 range, there's really nothing below 6K that I find that appealing at running back. So I think 23% is okay because of that, just a lack of options there. I'll probably end up a little bit below it though.
Boston Scott completely torched this Giants defense when Sanders went out last week on that Monday Night Football game. And I think one thing to take note is before that, and I just want to mention this, is because the previous 4 weeks, I mentioned this on the show yesterday, but the Giants in the last 4 games really had a kind of a stout rush defense. They only surrendered 1 touchdown on the ground and 215 yards on 67 carries. So obviously, a majority of the time where they've been attacked the most has been through the air. And I'm sure this Miami offense, we'll get into it probably with some wide receivers that could be in play depending upon injuries. But I agree. I think I'll be less on the field. I'm not sure I'm sold completely on him. But if you don't go to him as much, have you found anyone in that same price range at the running back position that could be as good of a play as him, but yet have less ownership?
Yeah, no, like the answer for me is just probably no on that one. It's like the ownership in my lineups are just going to become different at different positions, whether it's paying cheaper down at really good options at tight end we'll get to, or just wide receiver. So yeah, at running back, there's no pivots, and that's why I think the ownership is holding right now. I don't think there's any viable pivots. Bo Scarborough is questionable. If he was out, you'd have like J.D. McKissick and Ty Johnson. I don't even think that's a viable pivot against Tampa Bay.
Would you have any consideration for maybe a LaShawn McCoy, 4,400, or Adrian Peterson, who's at 4,400 as well? Or maybe even, let's say, if you pay up just a little bit, a James White at 5,400 in a really good matchup for him against Cincinnati. But do any of those names at all give you any confidence or at least some shares into roster construction?
Yeah, so I guess Peterson would be like the direct pivot there. You have no Geis. It's just still not a spot that I would rather get to, even for the ownership discount, than Laird, just due to the matchup and just passing game involvement. I don't really have any interest in McCoy. We saw last week Spencer Ware came off the streets and saw more snaps than him. Damian Williams is questionable. Either way, it'll be a 3-headed backfield, and they just seem very content with almost keeping McCoy on somewhat of a pitch count right now. We saw them healthy scratch him 1 week, say, to keep him body fresh for the playoffs. And then James White in a different price range, I would still pay down for Laird at $900 less there for just what is probably going to be 4 or 5 more touches, if not 6, 7 more touches. This is a week where they probably don't need White as much in that matchup.
The highest wide receiver comes up next, DeAndre Hopkins, 8K, going into Tennessee, at 20.5%. I mean, he's come alive 2 of the last 3 games, and really as they get deeper now into this run going into the playoffs, Clearly, we all know that he's Watson's right-hand man when it comes to the passing game. How do you feel about this play? Are you buying or selling?
Yeah, I'm buying it at 20%. I'm fine getting that or more than it. So Will Fuller is questionable, but leaning towards playing. We'll see if that holds up. He's been practicing. Hopkins, just as people would probably expect, has naturally been worse in those games where Fuller's in there, right? Just not as much of a ceiling to go around if Will Fuller ends up popping off. But I think it's still fine. Adore Jackson has been ruled out again for this one. The Titans are going to run out a cornerback trio of Ty Smith, Tremaine Brock, and Logan Ryan. Logan Ryan's a slot cornerback. Jermaine Brock was cut by the Cardinals earlier this year, a slot cornerback who now has to play on the outside. And then Ty Smith is going to have to individually guard DeAndre Hopkins this week. And I mean, they're clearly going to have to try and double team, which makes me really like Will Fuller this week. But Hopkins at 20%, whether it's stacking or not, is fine. $8,000, you have to prioritize it. So I'll probably end up getting to a lot of Hopkins in stacks, which might keep his overall ownership for me lower. But I wouldn't be shocked to come in somewhere around that. 15% seems a little bit more reasonable because, again, $8,000, I probably just prioritize it in stacks.
If Fuller doesn't play and you do have the mindset of maybe they do double team him, one guy that really disappointed last week that was at a price point that maybe people thought was a good play was Kenny Stills. And if this situation happens again this week where Fuller's out, do we see maybe a different side or a different take as far as maybe Stills being a better play this week compared to last?
Yes, I mean, he's currently at 1%. I don't think it'll come up all that much if it was another late scratch for Fuller. What you saw last week was Kiki in the slot getting a lot more action. Even when they were running through wide receiver sets, it was just Stills was not active. It's going to be another great matchup on the outside for Stills at 4,100. I'll probably go right back to it. I was on it last week and it burned me. But I'll end up probably going back to it. It's still a great spot for him, and I'll try not to let just last week's disappointment overshadow it as a really good matchup.
With Hopkins being so high up there, any love for Deshaun Watson? Because right now, currently, I mean, he's sub 10% on DraftKings ownership. And obviously, if we're projecting for Hopkins to really have a big game and in a great spot, are you okay with running Watson as far as that tandem?
Yeah, I really like Watson this week. I think the one issue, I like him in all formats. I think the one issue when it comes to GPPs is trying to figure out how you want to approach this if you're trying to game stack it. If this is a situation where it's always optimal to be trying to game stack, but where do you go? You have in my opinion, overpriced AJ Brown on the opposite side of that game. Then you have Derrick Henry, who is questionable for this week, but they're saying he's going to start at a really high price point as well. Henry seems like the obvious run back option just for upside there. But in terms of full on game stacking, I'm having trouble figuring out exactly where I want to go. But for their team individually, yeah, Fuller, Hopkins, and Watson stacks make for a lot of sense. This Tennessee secondary is using a lot of scout team players right now, and that's not a good spot to be in against Deshaun Watson.
Coming up next, Chris Carson, 7,500 going into Carolina, 19.5% currently, 200 less than Barkley. And I spoke about this yesterday, but I do like the position that he's in more now with Penny out as well. Clearly, we don't have to worry about any type of sharing. I think also CJ Procise last week really showed how inexperienced he's been this year with not taking first team reps. There were quite a few snaps where he was not lined up right, where he was confused on the play calling. And that really gave me the confidence to see them go back to Carson, even when they were down big to the Rams. So we know he's a workhorse. We know that they want to give him the rock. And this is a really great matchup for him. So how do you feel about Carson in this situation? And do you like Carson more than Barkley?
So yeah, that's a good question. So starting with, do I like him more than Barkley? I would say just if ownership didn't matter at both of their price points, I would still take Barkley. Right where Carson's coming in, 19.5, 20%. That's about how much I got of him. I did a crunch this morning, didn't fully have some stacking things done, so it's not 100% true, but I get right around that amount. I get around that amount for really all of those guys. Some are at 24, some are at like 17, but I feel really fine where that's at. Yeah, you said no Rashad Penny. Carolina's been really bad on the ground this season, also dealing with some injuries. 121 rushing yards per game, second most in the league. Most touchdowns at 21 or 7 more than anybody else allowed. It's a positive run blocking advantage for him. So everything's nice for Carson. He is priced up, so you're getting him up there, and he's probably deserving of this price for this matchup, but it's not like you're getting a discount on him, where I think for Zeke and Saquon, if anything, you're getting a discount. So I'll still take Barkley if you're talking about cash games. I'll still take Barkley just for one-to-one, but when it comes to ownership, a lot of these guys for my GPP lineups are probably all going to be within a few percentage points of each other. I think 20% on Carson is more than fair. If you had more than it, I don't think there's a problem with that.
The next guy we're going to talk about is in the same game. But before I get to CMC, I do want to just touch on this real quick with Carson and his price point and Barkley and his price point. Is this the week where you go two 7K running backs, or maybe 3K running, or three 7K running backs if you're going to put one in the flex? Or is this the week where now we can go into it? You got Patrick Laird and you just go straight to Christian McCaffrey because their price points together are less than maybe a Barkley and Carson or a Barkley and a Leonard Fournette.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go for more of like the mid-range approach so far for me this week. McCaffrey, I'm still getting at a decent clip. He's 18% owned. I feel not great about where I'm at right now on him, around 15%. But yeah, like your main value comes from the tight end position this week and then Patrick Laird. And if a lot of people are on Laird, it just makes the edge there and the value in that sort of diminish, even at 4,500. So I like the idea of having a lot more mid-range options to choose from, not just the 7K range, but I'm going to be shocked this week if my highest owned player, not even at running back, but on the whole slate, is Todd Gurley. So I think there's a lot of ways to just move around that mid 6, 7K range. I'll probably end up having a lot more lineups that show balance this week. The tight end position, though, having a lot of cheap options, even if you're looking at the 5K range, being cheap guys by their names, I'll make it viable to maybe go double tight end and get to more McCaffrey that way and be unique. So I think I'd lean going to the balanced approach, but I'll still get to McCaffrey in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, for 2 straight weeks now, we've seen McCaffrey being held out of the end zone, which, I mean, he's definitely still producing to some extent. I mean, it's amazing to see someone who is, as we say, is having bad games, but for other guys would be having optimal games. But it's his price point kind of just diminishes that. But his rushing totals have been down. He hasn't topped 70 yards rushing since week 10. Clearly, we know very talented. His price tag is still up there. But can we justify paying that price tag? Is it something where, I guess also for everyone who's in maybe higher stakes or people who are looking at automatically plugging in Laird and McCaffrey, but do you think McCaffrey is a better play than Barkley or Carson?
So for this week, I'll say no, just based on where lineup construction is going. And the other thing, like specific for this game for McCaffrey, you're going to have no Jadeveon Clowney and probably no Ziggy Ansah for Seattle, which in that situation is going to make it so there's no pass rush, already a bad pass rush, but no pass rush in Kyle Allen's face, which when he has more time to search downfield, Shaq Griffin, the number 5 Pro Football Focus cornerback, is also questionable for Seattle. If all these things work out and Shaq is out, you have a situation where there's all the time in the world for Kyle Allen to get his receivers downfield, which leads to less dump off passes or out of necessity dump off passes. So it's not something where I think it just turns the tides a ton. But if you're trying to poke holes in him, I think this is a situation where the passing game, especially downfield, is more favorable here. He's still Christian McCaffrey. He can go for 24 25 this week and be fine for you. But also at $10,000, if he goes for 24 or 25, there's a good chance one of these 7K guys pop off and you just don't need him.
And that's where I was going, because I think DJ Moore, it could be in a really great spot this week, and we'll get into him here shortly, because DJ Moore is just hovering over that 10% mark in ownership. But as we round out, you just spoke of him. It's the last guy we'll speak about for DraftKings. Todd Gurley, 6K, going into Dallas, 17.6%. Before I hand this over to you, we've seen a different change in this offense. Earlier in the year, I was really anti-Todd Gurley because of the way that the offensive line struggled to block. He couldn't hit holes fast enough. There was really not much of a burst from him, which really diminished any type of value of any big plays from him. And switching on and off with Malcolm Brown every single possession. So now, though, McVay, he's kind of held to his word the last couple of weeks, and we've seen that with how they're utilizing him. He's not splitting possessions with Malcolm Brown. He's hitting the hole better. Has a little bit better speed now. He could be where he's healthy. And the offensive line is actually blocking compared to what we've seen earlier in the year. So I'm going to leave it to you. Todd Gurley, you said he's going to be the highest owned running back for you. Tell us why.
Yeah, there's a good chance he will. So part of it is just the price at 6K for him. Part of it's just no other real value unless something opens up. So a lot of these guys are not breaking free. The 7K range for me is sort of cannibalizing its own ownership, like 15, 20% on all those guys, somewhere around there. But Gurley at 6K, it's a good spot. They told you the whole he's going to get most of the workload, goes out, gets 27 touches, runs a bunch of routes, 4 receptions. So that was all good to see just for kind of proof of concept for what Sean McVay was saying. But now you go into Dallas in a really nice game environment. 1-point spread should stay neutral. Dallas all season long is struggling against running backs, versatile ones, giving up the top 8 in receptions and receiving yards allowed to running backs, as well as being ranked 23rd in tackling. But the biggest thing for me is over the last 2 days, we've seen Dallas has ruled out both they're ruled out right now Van Der Esch, a linebacker. And it seems like Sean McVay, they're saying he's questionable, but hasn't practiced all week. So I'm going to assume he's out. So Sean Lee, that is. So both of their top running backs or both of their top linebackers are going to be out for this week in a spot where they're already struggling against pass catching running backs, already not great at tackling. And now the biggest pieces of the run stop are your linebackers, and they're not going to be in there. So it's just a great spot for Gurley. I liked it before based on the price point and the game environment. Now that two of his tougher opponents in the linebacker position for the Cowboys are going to be out, it makes it even better for his just ability to pick up more yardage and beat players to the edge.
Given his price point and really kind of the amount of touches that he could potentially get, why do you think he's not necessarily higher up there on the ownership?
I just think well, I think he should be. And I'm hoping that this doesn't change if we get an update tomorrow to see him like 25, 26%. I think there's a chance that could happen. But for right now, if I had to base it off of this, is just there's a lot of running backs in that 7K range that are sort of pulling each other's ownership away. You're seeing Patrick Laird pop up there for the probably Christian McCaffrey and Laird. So I think there's just a lot of running backs getting that ownership. There's a lot of different tiers to the ownership this week that makes sense. A lot of guys in the 7K range pulling it together. One guy hovering in the 4K cheap end range. And sort of, I think right now, he's not going overlooked at 17.6% above average in ownership. But I think there's just so many people pulling ownership away because there seems like a lot of optimal plays at running back this week.
Before we go into FanDuel, I do want to just touch on the tight end position real quick because coming in after Gurley and Fournette is a few tight ends. But curious on your thoughts of given this slate, how are you approaching tight end this week? Are you paying up or are you pivoting down to some value, maybe in the 2 or 3K range?
Yeah, so I was originally just going to have a ton of all these guys and probably get a lot of Zach Ertz just with him probably having to go out there and be the main guy. But what we got to see yesterday was Greg Olsen was ruled out and Gerald Everett was ruled out. So it opened up $3,100 Ian Thomas for his normal, or the last 2 weeks being normal, 35 routes run. The way they're using him is incredible. And then Tyler Higbee, the same thing at 3,900. So my game plan was to just have a lot of those tight ends. The Wallers and the Ertz were more of a priority for me. But now, as of yesterday, that news, I'm going to have a lot of Higbee and Ian Thomas, depending on the ownership. Hopefully it doesn't spike, but I'll have a lot of those guys pay down there, and it will allow me to get to 2 to 3 of those Todd Gurley and the 7K running backs. So probably right now going more of a value, but I do think Ertz is still a fantastic play.
If for someone who maybe is doing like a Laird McCaffrey, or a Laird, let's say Barkley, and you have that extra salary relief because Laird is in the lineup. Tight end, do you pay up or do you pay down still and really focus on getting some high priced, high volume receivers?
Yeah, it'll probably depend on ownership. I really want to see what happens on the next update with Thomas and Higbee. But if their ownership is fine, it's not 30, it's not like 25 or more. I think I'll just pay down to a guy like Ian Thomas. He was, out of all the games I've seen, outside of maybe the way George Kittle has been used this year, Ian Thomas was used better than any single tight end I've seen all year. He was motioned, which usually means you're trying to get him as a priority in a spot, motioned out wide, motioned into the slot in the backfield. He was just used everywhere. And it's not like his 35 routes a week are being empty. He's seeing 7, 8 targets. So at 3,100, it's really hard to ignore that usage. As long as he's not crazy high owned like he was last week, and hopefully he's not, then I'll probably just, even in that situation, get to a guy like that who has upside, maybe Tyler Higbee, and spend that money up on wide receiver.
Okay, let's go into FanDuel real quick before we go into really our cash game, GBP, and high upside guys. FanDuel is pretty much the same at the top in a different way as far as the order of these guys. But I guess we can speak on a couple guys that are up there, and that's Darren Waller, tight end 6,200 at home against Jacksonville. He's really done well in 2 games this year where he's exceeded projections and really have scored over 20 points. But outside of that, I mean, he's had 8 games where he's in the single digits. So given kind of the inconsistency, and we know he's very talented, we know he's a lengthy kind of hybrid type player, but has he done enough to really warrant that this price point is 6,200 when you could, let's say, go somewhere else like a Kelsey, who you have to pay up a little bit more, or maybe like a Kittle, that the volume is going to be there and the upside is much more. But Darren Waller being the 5th highest owned player, how do you feel about that at 20%?
Yeah, so I actually think it makes sense on this slate. Yeah, he hasn't been great. He gets Jacksonville, who has just been abysmal the last month. Really has nothing on that defense, and it seems like a really nice spot for at least this Oakland offense to get right. So I think it makes sense only because of salary where it is right now. It's not like DraftKings where Higbee and Ian Thomas are just wildly underpriced. They're relatively, especially Higbee, right next to Darren Waller in price point. So at that spot, I would probably take Waller. 20%. I really don't have a strong stance on it. You have a decent difference, $1,000 plus between him, Kittle, and Kelsey. So there's a reason people are paying down. I do think I would prefer Waller on FanDuel at that price point of 6,200, even at that ownership, over a guy like, let's just say, Hunter Henry in the same range, a lot more expensive for a guy like Ertz. If you're going to get Higbee at 4% ownership, though, right now, we'll see where that number changes. I assume it comes up. I would probably take Higbee if he's half his own over Waller at a similar price point.
For FanDuel, do you have any love for your guy Ian Thomas?
Yeah, definitely. So Ian Thomas right now, he's a little bit more priced up there at 5,300. Nothing crazy though. Similar love as on DraftKings. I would probably in most lineups just try and prioritize him unless that ownership shoots up to something above like 20% is where I'd start to just question how much of an edge is there really in playing him now.
All right. Let's go into the next half. But before we do, for everyone in here, don't forget, if you can give us a thumbs up, continue to support. We really appreciate you guys always taking the time out of your day to watch us and to continue to support us. It's greatly appreciated. And also for any of you guys that are not subscribers of Awesemo.com, don't forget, you can always get 50% off by using the code NFL Strategy. If you go to Awesemo.com/NFL, check out the landing page, check out all the different tools and resources, see what they're about before you actually get involved. And if you're wanting to try, you have 50% off your first month to really see if this is something for you and your fantasy skills. Let's go. GBP plays. And now, do you want to do it by game, or do you just want to kind of just, pick a few guys from each position?
Yeah, I'm down to do each position.
Okay. All right. So let's do this. Let's start with the quarterback position, and let's do GBP first. So who are your top 3 GBP plays this week at the quarterback position?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it'll be very much just like stack based. So it being GPPs. Yeah, I'll give the top 3 and then I'll give like a nuance to it. So for me this week, it's probably, as of right now, what I'm seeing will be a mixture of Deshaun Watson, Dak Prescott, and very close for third is a couple of guys, but I'll say Jared Goff. So that Rams and Dallas game I like a lot right now. That said, though, I have a lot of interest in Baker plus Landry stacks against Arizona. I don't really like the full game stack there. I just don't like what else you see out of Cleveland for options in their price points. But I do think Baker plus like a Landry and an Arizona stack, if you wanted to run it back with Kirk, I think that's a really nice option for GPPs. It just probably doesn't make the top 3 for me.
You mentioned Dak Prescott, and I really am just curious to maybe just go a little bit more in depth there because this Rams defense has been pretty solid against the quarterback position and really the passing games. With this Jalen Ramsey coming over, I mean, they've really switched up their schemes, and we've seen them shut down some pretty solid fantasy quarterbacks. If we're going to talk fantasy here, but Russell Wilson this past game, Kyle Murray. And even before that, outside of the Lamar Jackson game, they had really shut down the Bears, Steelers, and Bengals. So what do you see? Because for me, Dak Prescott hasn't really been on my radar. So I'm just curious to know what you're seeing so that way I can get an idea of looking at it from an opposite end.
Yeah, so they've been solid, and I think a lot of it is just their pass rush has been strong for the Rams. Ramsey has been improving. He had a really rough start, especially when he was in Jacksonville. He's been improving. Troy Hill has been good as their cornerback 2 on the outside, and then Robbie Coleman in the slot has been solid all year. But Troy Hill has not faced somebody like Gallup as a wide receiver 2 yet. And the biggest thing is their pass rush is getting there, and that just helps your secondary. The Cowboys actually have a positive offensive line just advantage this week. Their offensive line is just usually going to be an advantage. So Dak usually finds himself having a lot of time to throw. He has a plus 14%, so 14% higher than average pass blocking advantage. So if you just give me Dak with a lot of time at a fair price point, not too concerned about the injury. Everything out of Dallas camp right now is that he's fine. You get cheap price points on Gallup and you get cheap price points on Amari. And I like the individual matchup for Gallup. And I even think I like it for Amari, even if it is against Jalen Ramsey. So it's a spot where they're all cheap. They're coming in at low ownership. And right now, relative to the field, that's probably the spot that I'll have the most leverage over the field in GPPs in terms of stacking.
Any love for Jimmy G or Tom Brady and 2 of these guys who are in pretty good matchups that essentially could go off? If the passing game is right.
Yeah, definitely more so Jimmy G. There's some interest there. He's like a guy who falls into like the 7-8% owned quarterback range of just a bunch of guys for me. These other guys that I mentioned are probably somewhere around like 10 or 12%. So it's pretty balanced overall. But yeah, Jimmy G's fine. I think there's the concern that they get out ahead big and they run the ball, but it is a tough running environment against this Atlanta defensive front. So the matchup in the air is definitely the one they want to take advantage of, at least early on the first half, first three quarters. So Jimmy G, somebody I'll have some of. I think the stacks with Debo's, Kittles, even Sanders, if you wanted to, make a lot of sense. And then Tom Brady's just not somebody I've been getting to. It's a great spot against Cincinnati. I have a lot of interest in Edelman. He might be a top 5 owned wide receiver for me this week, but just finding the other pieces of that game that I like. Brady just not looking great all season long. The price point's still not that cheap, and then no rushing upside. I probably won't get much of Brady. I'll just take Edelman as a one-off from that game at a pretty decent size volume.
With a 25.8 run implied total right now, where does the scoring come from? I mean, if you know, and I say this because they really run Sony Michel the first quarter and that's it. It's very weird. Like you would think that if they ran Sony Michel like they do the first quarter every game, the entire game, Sony Michel would probably have so much fantasy upside, just based on the amount of production that he does in just one quarter, essentially. But I love the Edelman call at the wide receiver position. In this, well, I guess we'll get to when we get to running back, but with this high run and play total, I mean, it's one of the highest compared to amongst a lot of other teams. So it could be a spot where we could see this passing game. I mean, he's projected to be low owned and not anywhere, but 6K on DraftKings. I don't mind having a few shares of him in a matchup like you mentioned is really good for him.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And right now you're just seeing the cornerback play for the Bengals. It continues to get worse. Like Dennard is like their fifth or sixth guy they tried this year, and he's questionable for this weekend. So they don't really have much back there in Cincinnati at all right now. They're like hanging on just to close the season out in their secondary with a bunch of just practice squad guys continuing to get run. And now, as bad as Brady's been, it's going to be an easy matchup. You could play the narrative of them taking a couple of losses now, and maybe they're just pissed and they blow off steam in this matchup. So yeah, if you were to get to him, I would without a doubt have Edelman in every single one of those lineups. He's just going to have a smash spot matchup. So yeah, right now I'm probably not going to have much or any, but I think it's still a fine spot. The touching on just the team implied total is a good point as well.
For those who just do single entry or maybe a 3 max like yourself, who is the top quarterback at the top of the charts for you in that type of format?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would probably go. I'll get to a lot of Watson this week in those ones.
And cash game, is that the same thing for Watson?
Cash game, I actually think I like. So Watson's up there. So is Dak. So is Jared Goff, like I said. But when we're going to cash games, not caring too much about correlation, Kyler Murray becomes one of the priorities for me.
Yeah, I was going to say his price point and kind of the matchup for him. Uh, Also, given his price point and looking at that game, do you like Baker Mayfield at all on the opposite side of that?
Yeah, I like Baker. I like Baker a good amount. He's going to be a guy that I have close to like 8% or somewhere around there. So like if I was playing a ton of lineups, but he would be a guy if you're playing like 3 maxes that I would get in at least one of those lineups. And I don't really want to force in the full stacks here. You have Njoku priced up, and it's not really an appealing spot with how much tight end value we have this week. And then it's Odell against Patrick Peterson. And pretty much they've said it this year. Just Odell's playing on like one leg and a bum shoulder. And it's just not a good spot for him playing injured. And that 6K range is loaded. Like it's really hard for me to recommend, even if you're stacking it, Odell over Keenan Allen at these projections, DJ Moore that I have for these guys, similar price range. But Baker just plus Jarvis Landry. If you just want to go there, run it back with Kirk in a 3-man stack, I do like that a good amount. Baker is a guy I have a lot of interest in. Arizona ranks dead last against the pass this year.
Running back GBP. Who are your 3 running backs for that type of format?
Yeah, so I'll go 3 running backs for running back GPP. It's probably not going to shock many people, but Todd Gurley. Let's go Todd Gurley. I'll go Ezekiel Elliott just because I'll have more than the field on him, and then Saquon Barkley. But right after that, I mean, like Carson and Fournette and McCaffrey, they'll all be probably a total of like 6-7 percentage points away combined.
So, I mean, let's talk about this front 4 of this Rams defense real quick and really kind of how they've got taken advantage of opposing offensive lines. But Zeke is in a solid situation for him as far as price point. And when it comes to his ownership right now in DraftKings, I mean, it's 10%. So when you say over the field, clearly, I mean, it's easy to get there. But is he somewhat of a sneaky high upside guy compared to maybe what we're seeing at the top and him kind of maybe being overlooked?
Yeah, I think so. And that's like the biggest reason why I have more interest in him. If you're telling me that he's a third of the ownership as Saquon, same price point, these guys are going to see the same touches. Yes, Saquon's in the better matchup, but it's not like Zeke's a 10-point underdog. Zeke also has a positive run blocking advantage because he has one of, if not the best line in football. So, yeah, tough matchup against the Rams. They've been top 5 against the run this season. Good defensive line led by Aaron Donald. But when you have a really good offensive line in there, it almost neutralizes that. So, if Zeke's going to be a third his own, then I have the guy for 1.5 points less than Saquon Barkley just on a median basis, yeah, there's going to be a lot of the time where Zeke is going to outscore Saquon, probably half of the time, honestly. And in this spot, or close to half of it, but in this spot at a third of the ownership, it doesn't make sense. So your edge in playing Saquon, if he's 35% owned or so, is not as much of an edge. And then your edge in getting to Zeke when he's 10% owned is where the edge just falls to, because these guys have the same upside and even median projections for the same price point.
Ezekiel Elliott, just to go over real quick, he's played some really good rush defenses this year. Philadelphia scored 30 DraftKings points. Jets, he scored 30 DraftKings points. The Bears, somewhat of a solid rush defense, 23 DraftKings points. He's performed pretty well against good rush defenses. And then against those, I mean, he's had one bad game this year against the Vikings, essentially, where he had 8 fantasy points. But it seems as if, though, he gets more carries in those games against really stout rushing defenses. And that's pretty interesting. So I do love the call there. I think Ezekiel Elliott, in my opinion, him being at 10% and him being that same price point, in my opinion, I think he is a better play than Saquon this week.
Yeah, so like GPP, like in cash games, I would take Saquon, but in GPPs, like you're saying, yeah, for a third of the ownership, I think that's where the edge goes to. Like, I think more times than not, the ownership on these guys should be comparable around like 20% each, and then you can start to make a decision. But when it's this far apart, a 20% difference, you're just not having as much upside when Saquon goes off for you as you are when Zeke is, and it's going to happen at a similar rate.
Are any of these guys in the single entry format for yourself?
Yeah, I definitely think they are. I think all of them are. Gurley and Zeke will be in single entries, and even three max is a spot where I'll at least try to start a lot of my lineups. It's cheap and it's relatively average to low ownership on both of them.
Will Laird be in everyone's cash lineup, essentially, or at least the majority of them?
I think it'll be in a lot of them. I don't. I think it makes sense. So you're just getting value there. But with yesterday opening up tight end in Ian Thomas, and you get to save pretty much $2,000 if now you go off of that, or 3,000
Yeah.
even. A ton of money to go to guys like that or Higbee in cash. He's just not as much of a priority for me in cash. You're getting a good matchup and a lot of touches out of him. Are they high upside touches in Miami's offense? No, definitely not. So yeah, I even start to get to the 7K guys, the Todd Gurley's, and just a cheap tight end, even in my cash lineups, just playing with it right now.
Before we go to the wide receiver position, I do want to just speak on a couple guys like Dalvin Cook, like maybe Aaron Jones or Nick Chubb, who are just guys that will get really a lot of opportunities, a lot of touches, but there's no ownership really on them this week. Do you have any, as far as GBP purposes? I'm not talking cash game, I'm not talking single entry, but for GBP purposes, for anyone that's multi-entering, could you see yourself giving a few shares to these guys at all, or is it just not worth it?
No, yeah, I definitely want to. Like Cook and Chubb are both, I think, 1% owned this week. So I don't. If those guys are gonna have no ownership on them, I think it's at least trying to get there. Now I'll see what ends up happening. I don't want to like manually manipulate projections a ton just to get to 10% of those guys. But at 1% owned, you're really not harming yourself at all getting 5 lineups of them if you play 150. They're high upside guys. No Alexander Madison behind Cook this week, so that only helps him, even if he is a little bit banged up. Yeah, these aren't daunting matchups against the Chargers run defense for Dalvin Cook, definitely not against Arizona for Nick Chubb. These are good players that just haven't been producing insanely at high price points over the last couple of weeks, but you're paying up to be contrarian, crazy contrarian at that point. I don't prioritize them by any means, but at 1% ownership, if I got to choose and could manually do it, I would want more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to really playing a contrarian approach, there's no better play than someone who is being overlooked or is very low owned, but yet has the talent and has more than the ability to give you the confidence that they can really break the slate essentially with their upside. So,
Yep.
and I think those two guys we've seen both this year, once with Cook and once with Chubb, where under 2% ownership, I believe, and they both went off. And if you didn't have them, you really had no shot. So, just something to take into consideration when looking at these guys that have high ceilings. And I know that that might not be necessarily the best metric to look at, but there's upside there. And if you can fit them in some way and switch things up if you're multi-entering, I don't mind that approach at all. Wide receiver position. This is the position that I'm really most curious about because we've really spoke on a lot of running backs, and that's kind of where everyone's focus is this week as far as their top priority. But GBP, three wide receivers, give it to us.
Yeah, this part of it's just so hard because the entire like mid range of the high 5K to the high 6K range, that $1,000 tier between like 55 and 6,500, even up to Jarvis Landry. I mean, it's just phenomenal right now. And then a lot of these guys, there's so many of them that none of their ownership is really popping off. So you can get really creative. I don't have like a definite three for myself right now, but if I had to just give some for GPP purposes right now, I'm probably going to end up going with, in really no specific order ranking these guys, but Keenan Allen, he's at 8%, 6,300 versus Minnesota. I do like that spot a lot. I'll probably go to a lot of Michael Gallup this week, 5,700 versus Troy Hill in the Rams. And then Will Fuller. If anything, actually, I'd probably put Will Fuller number one. He'll get Tremaine Brock, who has been cut this year and is a slot cornerback having to play the outside. And the reason he went into the slot in the first place was he couldn't keep up with players on the outside. And now Fuller, if healthy, is one of the hardest people to keep up with in the league. So GPPs, just one-offs, not worrying about stacks as much. I like Fuller, Gallup, and Keenan Allen, but man, the range is just so good here when you have guys like Thielen possibly coming back, Robert Woods. You go up to the Landrys and DJ Moores of the world. That whole mid-range is where I'm probably going to be living this week in GPPs.
One guy that, as far as kind of the projection this week for me, that's really the highest wide receiver in the model is Chris Godwin. Mike Evans is out, and obviously we know Jameis Winston loves to throw the ball a lot. I mean, this is a really good matchup for this passing offense. Godwin, I would love to just get your thoughts on him real quick. He's currently 15% projected ownership, but if not Godwin, where do you see the target share of Mike Evans going to?
Yeah, so Godwin's in a great spot. He'll probably see Slay won't go into the slot all that often. We saw him do it against Keenan Allen earlier in the year for some snaps. So Godwin will have a lot of run against Justin Coleman, second most yards in receptions and most TDs allowed this season in man coverage. So great spot for Chris Godwin. Going to be on top of a lot of projection boards. You have to pay for it, but I think it's fine at that ownership. And then, yeah, I think the other targets are really going to siphon off too. We'll see what happens with Scotty Miller and his hamstring injury, but we saw last week, Justin Watson, 8 targets once Mike Evans went down. I think he's just going to take over the Mike Evans role. Brashad Perriman, his role is not going to change all that much. He had a good game last week, but all that really changed for him was he was going to see the same amount of routes as usual in a 3 wide receiver sets. All that's going to change for him is really not much. Like, he's going to see his bubble screens and his deep passes. He had 3 of those last week, and he caught all 3, a bubble screen and 2 deep passes. So I think Justin Watson, maybe some OJ Howard, you can say, but Watson ran all the Mike Evans routes last week in the route tree, and I think he'll be the guy to benefit the most.
I want to talk about Robert Woods, 26 catches on 36 targets the last 3 weeks. And I also want to get your take on Cup. But before we do, just speak on Woods for a second. He's 6,200. He's about 9-10% projected ownership right now. Given the amount of volume and really just kind of how they're utilizing him this last 3 weeks, how do you feel about him at the wide receiver position at 6,200?
Yeah, I think he's fine. He's sort of a guy that'll just have middling ownership when it comes to being a one-off because of Landry, Moore, Keenan Allen, all those guys in a similar price point. Even Devontae Parker now likely to play. It's just really tough to want to prioritize one of those guys when all of them are in great spots. I'll just get a lot of them. But when it comes to that game stack, he's my favorite guy to get from the Rams side of it. When it comes to the passing attack, you're just getting consistency. Last week, Sean McVay said that you had a combination of Woods and Cooks, or Cooks and Cup last week, playing less than 70% of the snaps combined. And Sean McVay said it was a scheme thing. Woods played 99% of those snaps. So it's very good to know that no matter what, he's going to stay on the field. He's had that connection the last 2 weeks. He'll probably face a Woozy this week, which is a fine matchup for Woods. So yeah, I'm fine with it at the price point. There's nothing that seems like a red flag outside of, or unlike his other teammates with Josh Reynolds playing 66% of the snaps over Cup and over Cooks last week. So yeah, no problem with Woods. I do have concerns with Cup. His price point is lowered, so it is very contrarian, and so is the ownership. But I just can't trust it right now.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to mention Cup real quick because in watching that game, he wasn't on the field a majority of the time. I mean, he played 20 snaps, and clearly, I mean, that's a complete opposite of what we've seen as far as the production and how he's been utilizing the offense compared to earlier in the year. So him and with McVay saying that this was a scheme type of thing, I agree with you. I think the confidence would be in Woods given that he doesn't come off the field. And I think Cup or Cooks now, based on just seeing that and seeing kind of how they're utilizing the offense, it's a little bit scary. But then again, he is 6,500. And I mean, for someone of Cup's talent and kind of what we've seen throughout the year, I don't mind it in a GBP style where having a few shares of him just in case.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was gonna say, it depends on like how much risk you're willing to take on. If you just look at this and say it's been a bad month for Cup, but as long as you don't expect, and I don't expect 29% of the snaps again in this matchup where it should be a lot of three wide receiver sets, he should get back onto the field. Then yeah, I would expect if anything, Cooks is the one who loses out because of maybe it's the head injury. Reynolds stays on a lot more in three wide receiver sets, but Cup is their slot guy. So as long as they go back to three wide receiver sets, they ran a lot of two tight end sets last week. They ran the ball 23 times with Gurley, so it makes sense. Cup just naturally came off the field. So I do think there's a merit to if you just can handle the risk that you're not going to get that low of snap counts on this guy. Again, it definitely was a scheming thing just for that matchup, I would assume. You're going to get probably more times than not close to triple the amount of snaps this upcoming week. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting spot to go to in GBPs. We know what this guy's ceiling is.
Single entry or three max. Who's your top wide receiver you want to have in there in single entry?
If Will Fuller is active, he'll be a guy that if I was building one lineup, I would try and get to him. He's 1% owned right now, but that's going to change because I think he's been questionable. He's still questionable, but he's been practicing this week. But at least that questionable tag is going to keep probably people who don't look as much into it off of him. But I think come game time, hour and a half before, he'll be in there. And yeah, it's a really good matchup for a guy who's just the definition of a GPP player. I would probably in one GPP single entry lineup at that price point go to Will Fuller.
I want to talk and speak on just a few cheap guys real quick and just get your take to see are they good plays or are they just really no, they're not good plays. So I really wouldn't go there. But in GBP purposes, I think Rashad Perryman could be somewhat interesting this week with the injury to Mike Evans. We kind of saw what we saw from him last week, whereas stepped up, got 6 targets, got into the end zone, was more utilized in the passing offense, and played almost 65 of 78 snaps. So running a lot of routes. He's not nowhere to be found. And I mean, I don't know how the defensive scheme will be this week in regards to Conley, and given that they only have really one powerhouse wide receiver now, do you double team him? How will they focus that defense? But what is your take on Rashard Perryman at 4,500?
Yeah, so I think I'm just based on all the value that's down there, and I think I'm indifferent to it, but it's grown a little bit on me. But I prefer Justin Watson on the same team. I don't think his role you'll probably see like an extra 1 to 2 targets, so volume changes a little bit, but the role change won't be there. He'll still be the outside burner or bubble screen guy. I think the role change comes the most for Justin Watson there, just directly filling in. We saw it a little bit last week. The fact that it looks like Devontae Parker's going to suit up kind of ruins Isaiah Ford's overall value a little bit. So I would now have Perriman in that value range over a guy like Isaiah Ford. But I think I still choose Justin Watson on his own team, looking more in this range at some of the value plays we have down here. I think I prefer Mike Williams against Minnesota a little bit more. D.D. Westbrook would now know DJ Shark is interesting to me. So he falls into a range of a guy that I'll have like middling ownership around the 5% range too. Definitely a big boomer bust play guy. We've seen it a couple times this year with the deep plays, but I just don't think his role is going to change all that much compared to Watson on his own team.
You mentioned D.D. Westbrook. From that same team, there's two Jacksonville wide receivers that maybe could be playing a much bigger role this week in the offense, given the Shark news. Keelan Cole and Chris Conley, both in the 3K ranges. Any consideration for those two?
Yeah, so DD would be the guy I would like in cash at 46. You could also play him in tournaments. It's fine. Matchup against LaMarcus Joyner in the slot. If you're going to play GPPs, though, I'd save the extra 1,000 and go to a guy like Chris Conley. I mean, he hasn't done much all season long, but he also hasn't had games without DJ Shark out there. It's a favorable matchup on the outside. Both of these defenses have been really struggling. So, yeah, I would go in this matchup too. If you wanted to choose one of these guys, Chris Conley in GPPs, DD's fine in GPPs, but prefer him more in cash.
And who's your just, I guess, your outlier guy from the wide receiver position, since there are so many choices this week, and there's a plethora of guys in the 3K range that people might go to, and then there's a lot of mid-range guys that people love. But who's your low-owned guy that could be the home run? He's your boomer bust.
Yeah, so I'll give another one outside of just so like that guy for me would be Will Fuller. I don't think he'll come above. He'll still stay in the single digits, even if the ownership comes up from where it should at that 1% mark right now. But outside of that, I think the other couple of guys that I really like in that range, it was going to be Isaiah Ford, but Devontae Parker coming in right now ruins that a little bit. I'll say Will Fuller, and then the other ones at just 8% is too low owned for me on Keenan Allen. I do like that. And then Devontae Parker, if his ownership doesn't rebound because he's been questionable to very questionable all week, but they say he's going to suit up, he'll get a matchup against the Giants. Outside of the names that I mentioned, I'll go Devontae Parker. Price point drops to 6,400.
All right. As we go into tight end and we close out the positional guys before we head into defense, tight end, single entry, three max. Who's your main tight end this week in that format?
Yeah, so right now in that format, it'll be very ownership dependent, but I'll probably go with Ian Thomas.
How do you feel about OJ Howard, given with Evans out? I mean, does OJ Howard see a bump at all?
Yeah, I have him in a player pool. I think he sees like a similar bump to Perriman, if not a little bit better, because Perriman's routes are a little bit just higher risk, higher upside. I think Howard still runs somewhere around 30 routes. I don't think that changes for him. So the opportunity won't change, only the volume might. So I think maybe you could project an extra target for Howard. So I think it's a little bit of an up spot here. Nice matchup against Detroit, 3,500. I would prefer Higbee and Thomas in the 3K range, but I'll have Howard as of right now. He's in a player pool for me.
Higbee and Thomas, do they slide into the GBP play as well?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really curious. This seeing what happens with the guys who have been questionable this week, like Devontae Parker, like Will Fuller, and then Higbee and Thomas. When probably usually on Saturdays we get an ownership run like any minute now. I want to see what happens with them, but as long as their ownership isn't crazy, yeah, Higbee and Thomas will be two of my higher owned tight ends.
Higbee is, I think, currently right now he's at 12%, but Thomas, he's only at 6.9%. And so, given that low ownership, and if that's the way that it continues to roll, that could be a great situation because I think last week, do you know what the ownership was on him last week in the GBP style for Ian Thomas?
I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure it was pushing like 30%, somewhere around there.
Yeah, that's what I think I remember that. I think in the Millie Maker, I think he was around 30%, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
I'll
he
have
was
to go
also. I
back.
think he was. I think he was the flat minimum or $100 off of it. So that's a big reason why. I would assume it comes up from the 6%, but now that all the tight ends, they're DraftKings got it perfectly right in my opinion on the pricing. These guys are all the really good ones. There's nobody popping up like Kelsey being 7K. They're all priced where they should be, 6 to 5K. So I think it'll just be a lot of balanced ownership. So if you think you have an edge on a guy, you can really get one there because the ownership won't follow it.
You mentioned one thing just now with Devontae Parker, and I just want to take a step back real quick before we close out with the defenses. But if Devontae Parker and Albert Wilson potentially don't play, and I mean, they have to be medically cleared. So even though they're practicing, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to play. We really have to find out to see if they're medically cleared, and then that's a whole different narrative. But if they're out, or if one of them are out, or if they're both out, do we talk about Isaiah Ford at all?
Yeah. Isaiah Ford would be like my favorite value play on the entire slate. Like more than Patrick Laird on his own team, more than Watson and all those other Perriman, all those other wide receivers. He'd be really good. Like I have him projected for them being in and out. And with him projected if Wilson's out, Ford will still play, but with Parker and he just won't be a priority. Allen Hurns will move into the slot, and then Ford and Parker will stay on the outsides. If they're both out, then yeah, Ford's going to be the priority on the outside. And you probably have a lot of Mac Hollins on the outside who did nothing for the Eagles and Hurns in the slot, a spot that Fitzpatrick hasn't looked to all that much. So yeah, if they're out, I have Isaiah Ford projected for around 13 fantasy points if those guys are out. And at 3,700, it becomes a spot where it's really hard to get away from in cash in really all formats.
All right, let's close it out with defense, Sal. Obviously, this is the position that it's always really a guesstimate to some extent with really trying to figure out and fire up the best defense possible on any given slate. But who's your top rated? Let's do top 2 rated defenses this week for GBP style.
Yeah, I guess I'm not like too sold on like this week. There's not a lot of guys in this cheaper range that I have a ton of conviction around. It just seems like a lot of defenses that should be down here. Jacksonville's defense has been terrible. They're 2,500. I usually like getting to cheaper defenses here, but a lot of these just don't stand out all that much. You have Minnesota against the Chargers. The Chargers are cheap, but Kirk Cousins only 3 interceptions on the year, not making mistakes. I think I actually have to go up a little bit this week to start liking some defenses. And it really starts around the 3K range. I think that if you wanted to get to a Packers team at $3,000 flat at home, really good pass rush. Mitch Trubisky has been playing better, but on the season, this pass rush for the Packers should be getting there with Will. I think that's okay. Taylor Gabriel's still out, so down some men. Packers at 3K stand out to me. And then you start getting a little bit more expensive. But yeah, there's really no cheap defenses. I think on the top end, I think Seattle was a popular one with how bad Kyle Allen's been the last couple of weeks. But Seattle has no pass rush, and their pass rush and Clowney is going to be out this week, and Ziggy Ansah potentially out, game time decision. if they have no pass rush, Kyle Allen's not going to make that many more mistakes, if any. So it's not worth paying 3,700 for. I like the Packers at 3K, and then just mixing around exposures of like 5% of all these lower owned defenses or lower price defenses is probably what I'll do. I think once again, DraftKings like tight ends. I think they got defenses priced right this week. You don't have like we've had half the weeks this year, like a Steelers type of a defense for number one overall defense for like 2,400.
Yeah, I think oddly enough, I really like to pay up this week at defense. And it's the highest price defense, if I'm not mistaken. But I think the San Francisco 49ers defense, they're 3,800, obviously pricey, but really nowhere to be found in ownership, projected right now in the 4% range. And at home, I think this is a bounce back game for this defense, considering what we saw last week against New Orleans. But a vulnerable Atlanta offense where Matt Ryan has turned over the ball quite a bit. So I don't mind them there. They are showing up as the highest rated for me currently right now. And then this is an outlier one, but I think the Washington Redskins defense at home against the Eagles is very somewhat interesting. They've really shown up the last 3 weeks, the pass rush, getting to the quarterback, and forcing turnovers. And for me, what I see is Carson Wentz, someone who has been very turnover prone this year. I could see a situation where the Washington defense really kind of causes problems for Wentz, and we could see some forced turnovers there. And I could see that offensive line where there are injuries getting to the quarterback and really committing those turnovers. So I like the Washington defense at 2,600.
Yeah, I think I'll add another one in. Also, yeah, you see the Eagles just banged up right now. Greg Ward's going to be like their number one wide receiver this week. That's not great. So that just echoes Washington as a lower priced team with some upside just due to the playmakers they'll be facing. Quotes on the playmakers, I guess. But I think my favorite defense, maybe on the whole slate, might be the Chiefs at home against Denver. You have Drew Lock, everybody riding high on him, but not Vegas. They still have a low implied total. Going and playing in Arrowhead and KC is just a brutal spot. KC is getting defensive linemen back, which is good. Frank Clark might play, but they're healthy with Chris Jones on their defensive line for pass rush. And their secondary has been playing very well this season. Brashad Perriman, getting older, journeyman cornerback, but again, having one of his better seasons of his career. Ward's been good. So $3,500 KC, I like that spot. The only issue I would have with the 49ers at 3,800, it's still just an elite defensive line. It's still fine. They have all the turnover upside in the world. But this week they'll have just a lot of guys injured. They got a ton of guys injured in that game. Richard Sherman won't be playing, and neither will Kwan Williams, their slot cornerback, or D Ford, one of their defensive linemen. It definitely changes things based on the price point. I think that's already built into the price point a little bit because those guys were doubtful to questionable to start the week after leaving last week's game. So 3,800, I still think it's a fair price point on them, just a couple of playmakers down.
I agree. I like that call. And before we go ahead and wrap this up, Sal, week 15, guys, once again, thank you for everyone for joining us. But what are your key final thoughts running through your mind as we approach going into 24 hours before lock?
Yeah, so I guess some of the key ones will just be watching these injuries. You're going to get a lot of good players at low ownership if they end up suiting up, like Devontae Parker if he's cleared for the concussion protocol, like Will Fuller if he's cleared. So I would watch that. And yeah, you just have a lot. There's not a lot of value at running back. So there's no reason to be forcing in really bad plays at running back when there's just a ton of value in the mid range at wide receiver, a ton of value in the mid range at running back, and then value at tight end. You can build a very balanced approach with a ton of guys who have 30+ point upside in all of your positions this week. So I think this week builds itself out right now to be a very balanced build. And just watch those injury news because a lot of them are going to, at least for me, shift how I build my lineups.
Yeah, I would say, this is a week where don't be too shy if you want to go ahead and put stock in the guys that maybe have tremendous upside that are low owned. And also, this wide receiver position, I think it's better off spreading it out and really switching it up, having a little bit more variance because of really how much value there is and how many mid-tier guys there are. Don't be so heavily concentrated because I think there's a majority of these guys that are in great spots that could potentially go off.
Yeah, I'll also say I'll say one more thing. I was looking at it before the show started, but Julio is 7,000 and he's 7% on this week. So talking about those wide receivers who are not getting ownership that can go off, he can go off any week. We know that he's been sort of up and down he's still on pace for almost 1,300 yards, a great season, but for Julio standards, not the 1,500 yard campaigns. But yeah, no Sherman, no Kwan Williams, who's a slot guy, but it's just really going to be Witherspoon out there for that defense and cornerbacks, mostly to an extent too. So still a tough matchup for Julio, but not the same crazy difficult matchup that people are probably fading because of the 49ers defense. They're down two of their probably best cornerbacks. So Julio at 7% owned, no Ridley either, so might have to force feed him. I think it is a really good spot at 7K for him at low ownership.
Yeah, and I think I'll say one thing. and this is very interesting to me, but for everyone out there, the 49ers offense is being heavily underlooked right now this week. They are projected for 30 points right now by Vegas, just under at 29.8% run implied total. And there's no ownership to be found on Sanders, Debo Samuel, Garoppolo. And they're facing an Atlanta secondary that we know can be thrown on and really can be taken apart. So I think after what we've seen over the last few weeks with Garoppolo, not necessarily the game manager that we've claimed him to be throughout the year, essentially being more aggressive, throwing big plays, and I think Emmanuel Sanders is someone on my radar this week that is going heavily underlooked.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I said it on Tuesday with Lofty that I think that game makes for a really good stacking environment. I've come a little bit off of it now, but at least on the San Fran side, there's going to be points. It's a good matchup. And then we just talked about Julio on the other side. I think there are some clear stacking ways that game can kind of pop off. And you've seen it so many times in Julio's career. His team can be out of the game, nowhere near it, and he still puts up 150-yard performance in just garbage time alone.
Yeah, I just don't get this happens a lot with games where these teams have high run implied totals and but people want to go to completely different opposite sides of the spectrum in games. This is one of those games again. It's happened quite a few times throughout the last few weeks. So I love the Julio Jones call, and I love running Julio Jones in that wide receiver running it back with, let's just say, Garoppolo and Sanders or Garoppolo and Kittle. So outside of that, guys, that's it for week 15. Final thoughts, awesemo.com. And a shout out again to our wonderful sponsor, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. But for everyone in here, give us a thumbs up, continue to support us. The more thumbs up, the more support you guys give, the more content we're going to continue to produce day in and day out. But before I let you go, Sal, where can we go ahead and find you and anything else you want to say?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at DFS if you want to give me a follow there. And then also I will be just live next week as well, normal schedule, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday on the Awesemo channel, 11 a.m. for NFL, talking week 16. I also have a YouTube channel if you want to check it out, just Sal Vetri. Also cover just daily fantasy sports over there. And no, that's it. No closing words outside of just track these injury news. If you have access to the Awesemo ownership, just check back in and see what these Ian Thomas and Tyler Higbee ownership shares look like probably later today.
All right. And for guys, you can follow me at Chris Randone on any social platform. Outside of that, good luck this weekend. Play great players. Don't overthink your thoughts. And someone take down some big